Manitou, Wami Masaganak Manitou, Kinuta, Nanapuwana Kobian Manitou, Tabatni, Katabatamish, EU Kisaka, Wanigan, Katabatamish, New Achieve, Wananuayonk, Nupiantam, Asakisa Kakish, New Achieve, Wami, Ninamasinawank, Nupiantam, New Achieve, Peoma Wonk, Nasusa Krashi, Nupiantam, New Achieve, Nishno Ohas Pamatak. Nupiantam and Kisaquad Nishno Motampan. Nina one Tabatantamawak Nuachi Keepa Numawak Wani. Nina one Tabatantamawak Nuachi Tahokamak Wanigan. Nina one Tabatantamawak Nuachi Wami Matugwash Ka Apashoa Wanash Wanigan Quinapoki. Nina one Tabatantamawak Nuachi Napisapag Ka Patuk Wanigan. Nina one Tabatantamawak Nuachi Nishno Ti Wani Nakititukam Wakosis Wabashaki Aho.
John Duffy wrote this book. I worked with him for 2 years on this book. This is a terrific book, and it tells a lot of things about your ponds, about the local areas, about the local Indians. I suggest if you get an opportunity, get a hold of this book, whether you borrow it or you buy it, whatever you do. I'm going to leave some literature here so you'll know you can go on Amazon.com and buy this very book.
My name is Donald Duffy, and it was a pleasure to work with Bob Wilder for some of this, and I'll get into that a little bit. First of all, I wanted to say that I use the word Indian, I use the word Native Americans, and I use the word natives interchangeably. I don't use indigenous, and I don't use Amerindians, however that's pronounced, which I found in Canada. So anyway, if you hear me say Indian, I'm not trying to insult anybody, it's just the way. 98% of the stuff I ever read had said that, used that term. Anyway, I'll start out with the watershed divide. Okay, go ahead. Whew. And I want to start with this watershed divide. And you may just for a second or two think I'm out in La La Land, but I am going to bring it back. So, the general terms, if you were to get into a car right now, let's just pretend for a second. Let's pretend it's raining cats and dogs. The rain is not seeking into the soil, it's running. If you were to get a car, and you're right out here, and you were fortunate to bring a raincoat and a rain hat, you got in this car, and you go out into this road right here, Route 148, and you went south, and you would come to a road called Old Fisk Road. Now, this is the first one, there's 2 Old Fisk roads, it kind of curves around. If you were to go another 1,000 feet past, the road kind of goes like this, slowly goes up and goes up and up. If you go about another 1,000 feet, there'd be the hill there. And if you parked your car, you put your raincoat and your rain hat on, and you went outside, there would be a place that if you looked to the west, like I am looking here, the west, if you stood out into the rain, the water would be falling on your left shoulder. The water would be falling, and it would go down towards Allen Pond. And then the water would go into the Quinnebog River. It would go into the Shintucket River, and go into the Thames River, and enter the ocean, pass through London, enter the ocean at Fisher's Island Sound. Now, at that same place that you were standing, if you got it right in the spot, the rain that fell on your right shoulder wouldn't go that direction. It would go this way, north, down to a stream that eventually took it into the Quabog River. So the reason I mention this watershed business is the nipmunks that I'm going to talk about are on that side of my shoulder, and the quabogs that were here are on my right-hand side of my shoulder. A watershed is something nobody thinks about because who's in tune to it now? You have your car, everybody, boom, 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 you're off. But it was a boundary marker often for the natives, that they knew that where the watersheds were, and a particular area belonged to them and another area belonged to someone else. So it was important to do that, to have that. The ones, and now I want to say something about nipmunks, the term nipmunks. Nipmunks is generally a broad term that's used to describe inland Indians, then they were near water and so forth, that name Nippy from water. And it's a general term. It covered all kinds of people, different dialects. And when I talk about nipmunks, I'm talking about those that are from like Woodstock, Connecticut, Union, Connecticut, Thompson, Connecticut, and then Massachusetts, Douglas, Webster, Dudley, Oxford, Sturbridge, Brimfield, and Holland. So over up there on the hill up there where the water's hitting you on your left shoulder, those Indians are there at nipmunks from what I call the upper Quinnebog River Valley watershed. And the ones are on the right of the quabogs. And the quabogs are connected with the river Indians, or Loops as they were called, in Pocumtuck from today's Deerfield, Nolwatucks from Hadley and Northampton, the Agawams from Agawam and Springfield, the Podunks and others in Connecticut down to the Farmington River. They were all called Loops, which is another term for wolf people. Now, I am going to just show you one little thing. Afterwards, I'm going to leave this up. What I'm going to be discussing on showing the differences between the two is, first of all, I have a blue line on this map. And it's probably hard to see from the back, I know it is. And that line represents the watershed map below to the south of Brookfield. So just on that where you were up on the road up there, now one of them blue lines. Now it's really hard to see a little bit, but there's a yellow line, and that is the deeded area that the Brookfield or the Quabog people ended up with from the Chautauqua, who was the local sachem here. So you can see that almost all of the area of the settlement, Quabog, Brookfield, was north of the watershed. It was on the Quabog River watershed. Now, the next point I'm going to make is about agriculture. And I was just I got a hold of a fellow named Al Smith, who was an archaeologist. And he has been sending material to me all week, including yesterday afternoon, late afternoon. And we had been talking about the advent of agriculture in here, in the Brookfields, and in the Connecticut River Valley area. And we were thinking agriculture began around 1250, 1250, 1250. And he sent me a bunch of material from, and I'm not going to go through it today, a bunch of people, and I found that a couple of things, that there was a person that just did a study in the squash. This is in southern New England. They have found evidences of squashes with testing from the years 90 BC to AD 200. Maize, which is corn, Indian corn, flint corn, hard corn. They made out of corn, meal, and different things. That was from 199 BC to 388 BC. So that's far earlier than I thought. I was also said it would be okay to say that the agriculture began here in this area around before the year 700. That's brand new material for me, and I was just lucky to get it. So anyway, how did we get here? How did the old Europeans end up over this neck of the woods? I think you have to go back to Portugal. And if you find in Portugal, there were some people, very smart people over there, who made designs of ships. And at some point, they had designed ships that actually could go great distances on the ocean. And once that was like a technology change, it's not talked about much, a gigantic technology change, because the world afterwards, eventually, people went every place with their ships, and they went here, went there, and so eventually even, somebody came over to our, Mass Bay, the Bay of main bays up through there and up to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and they found that there were all kinds of fish in the water, cod and many other fish. So that didn't take too long, and before you had other ships come along. And so what they would do, of course, is they would fish for cod, but they couldn't take the fish, only there's no refrigeration, so they might be 2 months getting back. So they would have to smoke it, or they would have to salt it, do something with it. So they were here for a while, and eventually they needed fresh water. So they would go to the shore looking for fresh water, and eventually guess who they bumped into? Some of the natives. So at that point in time, there was some give and take between the two parties on diseases and different things that were possible. Trading began. The Indians loved to get cloth. They loved metal goods. The English were over there. They loved to get beaver pelts for back at the hat trade back in England. So it kind of spread. Now, this is about the founding of Plymouth by the whatever they were called. Plymouth by, someone help me out. The what? Pilgrims, yes, thank you. So anyway, what happened was the Pilgrims landed in Upper Cape on the Mass Bay side. They made they kind of stole some of the Indian corn that was laying around, and they dug up some graves, and they really weren't that good about it. And they were kind of kicked off in the mid-Cape, and eventually they found Plymouth. Now what they found in Plymouth was a great chunk of land that had no trees on it, fields that had been previously fields. I don't know how many years it was left, but what they also found was the Indian bones. There was there were a village there, and they found bodies. Some of the bodies was bones sticking up, and others were just bones on the top. The entire village was destroyed by a virus. And so one of the reasons I like Plymouth primarily was because of all the agricultural land, that they didn't have to turn forests into fields, and they could plant the next year. So that's one of the big things was diseases that the Europeans brought over. Now here in 1633, a disease of European origin arrived in the Connecticut River Valley. It was catastrophic. A lot of folks had called the disease smallpox. Researchers have speculated that 90 to 90% of those infected perished. Now just think of that. 90 to 95% of the village was destroyed. They were gone. They had died. Now there's a fellow named Charles Mann, an author, Charles Mann, who wrote a book, 1491, and a companion book, 1493. And he described how, and I cannot describe it in a biological way, I just have a very crude way of explaining this. But let's start out with the Indians. They were hunters-gatherers for most of their, up until fairly recently. When they were over in Asia, they didn't live in the downtown cities over there. They were chasing animals and resources wherever they could. So they had small family groups, and they didn't bump into lots of different people. When those Asians came over, followed into the North America, there was a wealth of animals, mammals in North America, and they followed, and they expanded, but they always were following game and salmon, fish, and different places, any of the resources. So they really didn't interact with lots of people. Some they did, but they didn't really interact too much. So what happened was, in the cell of some of these Native Americans, There were in people cells, all people cells, there are little creatures, they're not even creatures, little organisms, that when a virus gets into the cell wall, they take the cell and they kind of like a Pac-Man thing, they take the invader and place it to the wall of the cell. And then the white blood cells come along and get rid of it. Now over in England and Europe, they had a whole bunch of these in their cells because they were in more tight, more together surroundings, and they were more used to having certain diseases. Now, the Native Americans had some of those in them, but not as many, and for different things than the Europeans. So when the Europeans came along in 1733, one of them was the smallpox, and it would infect one Indian after another, and there were deaths galore. And so whatever happened, let's go back, under agriculture, the groups around here expanded because they had a better source of food, more consistent food. They didn't have to chase resources as much, and so therefore the population expanded. So now what happened in 1633 was they got nearly wiped out by a disease. And then in 1634, another disease made the rounds. And so after this time, they were very more limited. So what happened? Now this is the English. They were, in Plymouth, they were in Mass Bay and so forth. And the Pequot Indians controlled, through conquest, the lower Connecticut River Valley. And so there was some particular arrangement between the Dutch and the Pequods to allow a trading post to be established in Hartford, and one was in 1633, same year as the disease. Wethersfield, Connecticut was founded around 1633 to 1634 as a farming community as well as a trading post. The Hartford was a trading post, similar to the one the Dutch had in Fort Orange in Albany area. Anyway, later on, William Pynchon, the founder of Springfield, was in Springfield, Enfield, and Agawam in 1636. In 1637, the English had enough of the Pequods, and they killed amazing amounts at Mystic, Connecticut. And the Pequod nation, as a nation, really was no more. There were still Pequods, but they never rose to the level of returning as a nation. So, and then Windsor was founded in 1637, all in the Connecticut River. So, now we go to the founding of the English community at Foster Hill here, called Quebec. Picture this. William Pynchon is trying to trade for beaver skins. He was an active trader of beaver skins for the English hat market. What he would do, he created a warehouse at Warehouse Point in, I think it's Windsor, and he would store his beaver pelts in barrels, and he probably would receive goods from incoming ships. And he would send out his beaver pelts once a year, and a small boat would come up, a sailboat, but one of the smaller ones, because the river isn't that deep and there's all kinds of problems with it. So they would take a small one, they would go out to the Connecticut River, out to Old Saybrook, and they would go across Rhode Island, across Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, go all the way around Cape Cod to Boston, and then it'd be unloaded and be on a much bigger ship sent to London. Overland, the original Bay Path, the original one, not the one we talked about earlier, the Indian Trail heading easterly from Springfield went from the top of one hill to another, from Springfield to Bald Peak in Munson, from Fenton Hill in Brimfield to Storage Rock, also in Brimfield, to Fisk Hill in Sturbridge, to Charlton past today's Bay Path Regional High School, then across the French River in Oxford, And the French River in Oxford was so small, it was a medium to small stream at that point. So that's where they went. I'm not going to describe the rest of the path. The ones that came from, went to Wethersfield, probably at around Dudley area, Webster Dudley, they dropped down. There was a path going to the Woodstock, into the Wabaquassets, and then across to the Hartford area. So now, as it was, there was another trading post established, but in another direction. It was in 1643. A trading post was established in what was called Nashaway. Later, this was called Lancaster, Massachusetts. It was east of the Mount Wachusett River and along the Nashua River. The Quabog village was just south of Wickabog. It's usually called Wickabog. And near the Quabog River, and actually if you saw it, it's probably that flat area around the Chinese place on Route 9, near where 67 comes in. There's a flat piece of land, and that's probably where Wickabog was. And let me just say the different pronunciations of this. And I think it was pronounced by Weekwitchabog. And Weekwitch was an Indian term from the Native Dictionary, and meant at the furthest extent or the utmost area. So if you went up there in that flat area, you would see that the end of where the water runs out of the lake and enters the Quabog River, it on that flat area, that where it ends, that is where it ends in a sense. And I believe that was the meaning of Weekapog, or however it was pronounced and then changed, and somehow it eventually became Wickabog. I believe it means the village at the end of the pond. Now, that particular village was roughly 20 miles from Lancaster, Nashaway, and 20 miles to Springfield. It was right in the middle. So John Pynchon, his father, William Pynchon, wanted to establish a better way to get goods and things back and forth between Mass Bay and Springfield. So anyway, at one point in time, a fellow named John Winthrop Jr., son of the governor of Mass Bay, went on and he was a fellow who ended up owning the black lead mines, graphite mines in Sturbridge, many properties, and later was the governor of Connecticut. And in my opinion, John Winthrop Jr., when he found the new way of travel, found the Indian Trail from Lancaster back to Wickabog, and found it significantly easier than the original Bay Path. At Wickapog, he had to cross the Quabog River into Warren and travel to the east side of Sturridge Rock and then rejoin the path to Springfield. I should say, since we're talking about Bob Weiler today, I should say Bob Weiler cautioned me that trail ran to the east of Sturridge Rock and not on the other side, and he was very definite about that. Years later, another fellow and I found what we thought was the old trail, as it had cellar holes adjacent to the ancient path. In one farm, you could see evidences of a Virginia rail fence, the stone basis of the fence. So it then continued south and continues into Prospect Hill Road in Brimfield. So anyway, the point was that Pynchon needed a way. The other ways over the mountains, around the hills, were very often steep and rocky and were designed for foot traffic. And so they would go around whatever was around. Nobody moved anything. So they weren't wide. But Pynchon needed a place to move product and to get back and forth. Now, the only problem with this scheme right now, which is having a inn at Wickabog, and so Wickabog was like halfway between Lancaster and Springfield. The only problem with that was you still had to spend a night out in the woods someplace. 40 miles with the horse didn't make it in a day. So you would have to go there, and if it was raining, there's no weather forecast then. So if it turned up raining, you'd soak, and well, I suppose you spend the evening under a pine tree or someplace. But you had no idea what the weather was going to be, and there was no cover for you, and you're cold, or any bugs all over the place in certain times. So they needed a place in the middle, and Pynchon thought Brookfield was just the spot. Foster Hill would be, Wickapog area would be just the spot. Now, so that's what the English wanted. They wanted an inn and a reception area up in Brookfield. Now we go to the Quabog Indians' perspective. Now, it's not known, first of all, if all those diseases went through the area here. We do know it was in Connecticut River Valley. And it's not known, we do know that the two main villages, and I'm not counting the three at Menamessic, I'm not going to discuss those. I'm going to discuss two here. So we just had a little discussion on the meaning of Wickapog at the end of the pog. The second one is what I believe was written as, or said as Misquabog, and sometime later it might have been Masquabog. I believe Misqua and Masqua mean red in Algonquin. I call Quabog Pond, a Quabog Pond, I should say. I call it the village of the Red Pond. That's how I read it. The water has a tinge in it, and it makes sense to me. Early in the English, sometimes noted it as Squabog. Soon it became Quabog, Quabog, however it was pronounced, and it was standard in its use. Much earlier in time, though we change a little the gears here, the fellow Loups or Wolves in the Connecticut River Valley were defeated by the Mohawks from New York. They were known as part of the Iroquois Confederacy and the keepers of the Eastern Gate. They were aggressive and voracious. They were not Algonquian tribe, and they were a different language group. In 1636, probably after the Pocumtucks and the other Loups were decimated by disease a few years earlier, the Mohawks beat the Loups in Connecticut Valley in warfare, or else the Pocumtucks and the Loups saw the numbers that were coming at them and just said, okay, you got it. So one of the options that I've seen the Nipmucks use, the Nipmucks Quinnipiac Valley, when they were confronted by overwhelming forces from the Pequots, was to just say, okay, it's yours. We want to stay here. And in the Pocumtucks and the Loups, after the visit by the Mohawks, the Loups were allowed to stay, but had to pay a yearly tribute to the Mohawks. The natives of today's Northfield, the Squawkigs, a branch of the Abenakis, did not agree with the Mohawks and paid no tribute. The Squawkigs, the total Abenaki land was essentially much of northern New England, extended from the east of Lake Champlain, perhaps up to the St. Lawrence River Valley. The Squawkigs had a powerful fort at Hinsdale, New Hampshire, and defended themselves from a Mohawk attack. The Mohawks were able to defeat them and left them and said to the Dutch on the way back at Fort Orange that they had lost 100 men. There was a lot of bad blood between the Squawkigs and other Abenakis and the Mohawk. After the attack by the Mohawks, the Squawkigs melted away into Vermont and New Hampshire and never to be seen by the Mohawks again, at least these folks. They didn't have anything to do with them. The Pocumtucks also had joined with the Pocumtucks. Okay. The Pocumtucks also had a few important but minor differences with the Mohawks, and had captured a few Mohawk people. And they had decided, through some intermediaries, they decided to have a little get-together and sign a treaty. And what happened was a Sahida from the Mohawks came down, and they had their little group down to the Pocumtucks, and slightly as he was leaving, somebody killed Sahida. They murdered him. Now the Iroquois, the Mohawks, were just incensed. They were furious. About a year later, there were, as going past Fort Albany, it was reported they had 3,000 Seneca and Mohawk warriors left for Fort Albany. On January 25th, 1665, they found the Pocumtucks at Deerfield and destroyed them, everyone they could find. There were a few Pocumtucks who were on the other side of the river and that they didn't get. Back at Quabog, the natives knew that they were in potential deep trouble. So what happens, they had a discussion with John Pynchon, son of William Pynchon, and they decided to let some English farm in their midst, hoping the English province might provide some safety from attacks by the Mohawks. Perhaps it was thought the Mohawks might realize that the Quabogs paid a tribute to the English and therefore belonged to the English. A deed between the Quabog sachem, Chattaqui, also known as Chattaqui, and a survivor of the Mohawk destruction of Pocumtuck's Metawamp from the royal line of the Loops at Pocumtuck and Ensign Thomas Cooper was signed on 1665 November. John Pynchon was a member of the Mass Bay legislature and he witnessed the signatures. What it was, they both, the English and the Indians, the natives, had a reason to sign the deed. The English had different scope of deed than the Indians. But anyway, I won't go into how Bob Wilder and I got to this point of this and this, but it was an interesting trip. I enjoyed Bob Wilder and we did some great stuff together. Finally, I guess I'll talk about Henry Kwakwakwa quickly. Henry Kwakwakwa was a baby or a boy when the King Philip's War occurred. And he ended up leaving with some other Quabogs to Hudson River Valley. And at some point, he came back to what is now Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where there was a reservation. And he, I believe, was the son of Quacum which is the name of the South Pond. And if you look at his name, Kikwakwa, you can see the two Quakwas in his name as well as Quacum. And he asked the local lawyer to make a claim against the Massachusetts government for payment. And they made 3 payments. They made 3 requests for payment and didn't receive a dime. And however, there was an English-speaking teacher in Stockbridge, and he recorded what Kikwakwa thought was his land, which ended up pretty much being the Quabog, the Chicopee River watershed. So I thought it was a very important piece of information, and I guess I'll leave it like that. I do have, I brought my books, the one Bob Wilder talked about in this one. This has Kikwakwa stuff in it, and that is the other. After this is all done and we're downstairs, I brought a few that are $20 a piece if anybody wants them, and we'll leave it at that, okay?